Azure Services for Artificial Intelligence with Jason Haley.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies that are building mission-critical software systems. Quick announcement, we are in the second year of my Architect Forums. Signups for the next session are up, and if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with other peer architect leaders, then just sign up at the link in the show notes. And I'm also launching a new software leadership forum for technical executives who oversee software engineering groups, CTOs, VPs of engineering, engineering directors, etc. If you oversee software development for your company, but are not in one of those teams yourself, then this forum is for you, and it'll focus on topics specific to the management leadership for software engineering departments. And if you're a developer listening and would really love your boss or your boss's boss to be in a forum like that, then please pass the word. And for those looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is Jason Haley. He's a full stack solution architect at Jason Haley Consulting LLC, and he provides custom Azure and .NET application development solutions for various clients, leveraging over 20 years of experience using Microsoft technologies. And he's also a Microsoft Azure MVP and has earned lots and lots of certifications over the years. He specializes in developing web applications and single-page applications using Blazor, Angular, jQuery, ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework Core, Redis, SQL Server, Windows Azure Active Directory, and he also designs and implements web applications using all kinds of additional technology, and he builds custom build processes for Azure DevOps pipelines and also creates courseware for .NET and Azure topics. He's passionate about learning and sharing knowledge with the local Azure and .NET community, and also runs 2 user groups in the Boston area. Well, Jason, welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you here, and I'll put links in the show notes, but I love your blog over at jasonhaley.com, and you've been doing a lot of work with the AI services in Azure. I want to ask you about that. But before that, for people who haven't been to your user groups or haven't heard you speak, can you kind of back us up? You've been doing custom software for a long time. Are there any moments in your career that were kind of steered you in the direction of your current focus?
I would say in my career, I've had 2 that really stick out. One was the release of .NET, because that kind of focused where I was going to go with the languages and the platform to build on. And then more recently, Azure, which was again, what was that, about 14 years ago?
Mhm.
Azure was another big moving point. And then more recently, it's been the whole GenAI change. And, typically I am not a leading edge developer. I'm usually working with financial companies or smaller companies who can't afford to be on that bleeding edge. So they've kind of have to use the tried and true software and frameworks that have been well tested, and someone else has kicked the tires on them. And then, of course, they want to get as much ROI out of that version that they possibly can before they invest in rewriting things or upgrading things. Well, of course, they'll upgrade them
Yeah.
for maintenance purposes, but they don't just drop off the cliff because there's a new version out and start rewriting things, because they can't afford to do so. So my history is with companies doing that. My first full-time gig was for an insurance company, Zurich Insurance, very large insurance company. And that's kind of where I picked up that mindset that I don't really jump on the bleeding edge of things. So when GenAI came out when OpenAI released their Chat GPT, I didn't jump on the bandwagon so much. And I kind of regret that I didn't pay more attention to it when it came out. And that's been what, a year and a half now.
Mm.
And I started paying attention to the Gen AI technologies about the time the Copilot chat came out. So Microsoft's tooling again. So I saw an intro of it. I think it was at the MVP summit last year. And that really got me thinking about it. And then around July, I started toying with it and started using it and getting more into using it. I started using like the image generators to create like images for blog posts and stuff, as
Mhm.
opposed to I used to not really input images in presentations and stuff. But now with Gen AI, you can create images so easily with a theme that you're looking for and I got more and more into this. So I started last October, I think it was, is when I decided, you know what, I've got to start catching up on this. Because at that point, I was close to a year behind when ChatGPT came out. So I was just feeling like here I go again, get on that bandwagon and start really sinking my head into it and purely focusing on it. And of course, I've got clients. I can't purely focus on it, so I start putting a lot of extra time into it. And this year, I've been putting more and more focus into it than I have. So I've been cutting back on client hours. And in late January, is when I discovered RAG, so retrieval augmented generation. That's
Mhm.
when kind of got off course. I was going to do the AI 900, which is the fundamentals exam for Azure services. And I got sidetracked with RAG because this whole time when I was looking at Gen AI technologies, what you can do with them, where the value really is, I was thinking, okay, for my customers, a small company or even I don't have any medium-sized companies right now as clients, but like where can a small company get value out of Gen AI? Because everything I'm seeing there's no huge win. It's a lot of little
Mhm.
wins. Like, it's kinda like automation in that sense, or maybe an analogy would be, winning the lottery, but playing scratch tickets and not Mega Millions. You're not gonna win that
Yeah.
huge windfall, but you have a lot of small wins.
Mhm.
So, as I'm looking at it, I'm like, "Okay, well, I see how this technology could help them save some minutes here." A lot like automation. Companies often don't automate things they should just because they say, "Oh, well, it would take a few days to automate. We don't really wanna pay you to do that, it's only a few minutes here and there," you know but you take something as simple as a form letter whenever you're sending a lot of, proposals and stuff out to clients. If you
Mhm.
take the time and create that form letter and connect it to a CRM system, once that's done, every time you do it, you're saving minutes. And
Yeah.
minutes, I mean, you're talking 10 to 15 minutes uh, at a time. But if you do that so many times over the year, it does pay for itself and it does make your life easier and it removes that toil that you otherwise do. It's like you've got in your head, there's a better way to do this. I shouldn't be doing this. I should take the time to automate it, but you just don't. And with this Gen AI wave of technology and features and all of this stuff has just got me thinking. It's like this is where it's going to be for my clients. And RAG was the one that really stuck out as okay, so this is that typical chat with your data scenario that everyone's heard of by this point.
Mhm.
And chatting with your data is pretty interesting, but it alone, again, what problem is that solving that you already have? I mean, you kind of have to look at it as a solution mindset. It's like, what problems do I have that I haven't solved or I haven't solved well that this Gen AI technology can start to do for myself or my customers? And
Mhm.
the first step, of course, is understanding what Gen AI is and what are some of the solutions that it can provide for technology solutions.
Now you've gone really deep into it, because it still is early, even though the services are GA and Azure, Azure, the Azure Open AI services, and the semantic kernel, and you've written quite about them on your blog on jasonhaley.com. And so, from the perspective of a .NET developer, and you mentioned the chat with your data scenario.
Mhm.
I agree. That's really compelling. If we can take the data in our custom software system and then use that to ground the model somehow in the generation, that's a scenario that's a no brainer, at least in some slice. So then the question is okay, how do I add it to the current custom software system, or how do I create a side application? So for the .NET developer out there, what's uh what's the quickest way to get that kind of feature up and running?
Actually, so preparing for this podcast, I put some thoughts together, and the one place I would suggest you start, especially if you're a .NET developer, like I am, full stack developer with SQL Server background, ASP.NET, I would check out Michael Washington's blog because he's got some really good articles on there. And the first one that I saw that really made all of the pieces come into place for me, he has one written on using SQL Server to do a RAG application. And you can use a vector database. I'd heard what those were before I started looking into or really digging into the AI stuff, but I didn't know what it was. Conceptually, okay, vector database, all right, got it. It's storing a bunch of numbers. Okay. But the good thing about his blog article is he implements a Blazor application, uses OpenAI to create the embeddings, but then he saves those in the SQL Server. And then he takes text and then puts it into the SQL Server. These are all tools I was super familiar with. OpenAI is just an API that he's calling. So
Hmm.
the way that he writes his sample code and his explanation just made it all click to me. It's like this is a .NET application. I can do this. It's just an API. That's the OpenAI endpoint. Cool. I've used many APIs in my career. So that's conceptually easy to get. And then he's using SQL Server for the storage. And that just made it click that, this isn't all that different of a technology. There's no magic here.
Mm.
It's still just an API endpoint that you're sending it information and it's returning information. And of course, he uses two flavors of APIs in that demo. One is embeddings, and then the other is the chat with the LLM. So the embeddings thing is the concept that a lot of people kind of get stuck on because I've presented the getting started with RAG a few times, and a lot of people really aren't familiar with embeddings and vectors and all of that stuff. And it's easier if you just say, well, semantic search, because the whole RAG thing is really two systems. You've got the retrieval side of things where you're just doing a smart search before you pass it off to the LLM. So you want to craft a useful prompt so that the LLM is grounded, as you mentioned, in what you want it to use to make the logical reasoning to respond with a nice natural language response to your
Hmm.
question. And that semantic search is really useful, but it's not the end all be all either because it will only find meanings and concepts in a block of text that you've gotten these embeddings for. Like for instance, if you have an article, like for right now this week, I'm focusing on GraphRag. So I've started this week, or this month, I started doing study topics for a week. Last week it was text to SQL, and then this
Okay.
week it's GraphRag. I'm hoping GraphRag will do this because what I'm about to describe, regular RAG doesn't do. So there's this article out there. I believe it's called like 18 mistakes that startups make, or something along those lines. The key thing is there's no place in there. There's not a beginning and an end, or like a conclusion, because it's just an essay or a blog post. It's by Paul Graham. But he categorizes 18 things throughout it. But RAG, unless you give that whole article as the context of the LLM, is not going to solve the question, what are the 18 mistakes?
Mm.
Because whenever you do embeddings, you chunk that up into smaller pieces so that your meanings are more descriptive, more fine grained. So most likely you'd have like at least 18 chunks of information. So they're all spread across. So it won't solve that global question. What are the 18 mistakes in that corpus of that document? So that's where semantic searching starts to fall apart because it's not capturing global concepts. But GraphRag, and I'm learning. I've only spent a handful of hours on this so far.
Hmm.
That it is better at extracting the entities in the corpus and then creating relationships between those entities so that you can ask higher level global questions of your context to then pass that off to the LLM. And oftentimes it'll be like the entities and their relationships with some context instead of just bits and pieces of, say, a PDF. So it's there. There's not one given way that's going to solve your problem. And again, that's that retrieval system that's before the generation where you're asking the LLM to actually answer this question with your result. And back to what you were saying about the .NET stuff that I've got on my site is as I've been looking into Gen AI in the last 7 to 10 months now, it's led by Python. Python is the predominant language, and it makes sense. AI and ML engineers have been using Python for a long time, and C# will do the API calling. It will do the web applications that all these people are putting on front of these APIs. So the question I always have in my head when I'm reading a sample, and all it is calling OpenAI's API or one of the other APIs,
Hmm.
is, well, why isn't this in C sharp? Why isn't there more examples in C sharp or more people um, providing this type of information in C sharp? So I've really done quite a bit of digging to locate stuff, and sometimes it's just not so easy to find C sharp examples of how to do these things. But there are a few out there. It's just they're hard to find.
Yeah. there's there's quite a bit of inertia when something happens, because the early, like you said, the early machine learning technology, the people working on that kind of chose Python and put that in motion. And there's quite a few libraries in Python, for all this stuff like NumPy, Pandas, just to name a few that I remember. But you're right. If it's just a HTTPS API, then it really doesn't matter the application that's calling it. It's just a web service, right?
Right. Absolutely. And that's where sometimes I get frustrated with this. Like, for instance, Microsoft just released GraphRag as a Python library last week or the week before. As I'm looking into, I kind of picked the topic GraphRag early last week as I was doing the text to SQL stuff. Text to SQL, there was some stuff out there related to semantic kernel. Oddly enough, though, it was in the kernel memory repo, not the semantic kernel repo. But there was an implementation for text SQL out there, or text to SQL, or it's actually they called theirs natural language to SQL, kind of the same thing. And there were a few other Microsoft people out there who had some articles and some repos, but I'm not finding anything on GraphRag yet. Uh, Microsoft they released a paper calling it GraphRag, and they released like I said, a Python example or library and example within the last few weeks. And they've got several other, and they're all in Python. They don't have any in .NET. And
Mm.
that's understandable, but one of them is an accelerator where it's not necessarily using the library itself. I can understand the service that's using the library, but the stuff that's calling the API, you could totally do that in C sharp. There's no reason that it would have to be.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo.
Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
So if I simplify this down to the most basic, tell me if I'm thinking about this the right way. I have my .NET application, which has some my own data in SQL Server, and I just call the web service to OpenAI, and I pass it in an English question, just like I would use on Chat GPT, and it's going to give me back some type of response. Um, but you mentioned embeddings.
Mhm.
Um, how much how much data can I pass it? What's the limit and how does that work? And do I prep it one time and then ask it and then have a bunch of calls with questions, or do I pass that data every single time I call it?
Yeah, this is where the more you play with it, when you're beginning with it, the more you start to get frustrated because it really is a lot of these techniques are really just prompt manipulation. So the whole prompt
Hmm.
engineering that they refer to, it's what it comes down to because that's how you're communicating with the LLM. And the size of context that you send or the amount of text in that prompt that you send to the LLM is going to be most likely more than you want it to be. So when you're just asking it a question like, when did the American Civil War start? What
Hmm.
caused it? That's you're using it as the source of data. So which is a risky thing to do, especially in a business application. You wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
But that's a very small prompt. But if you're asking it, so say you have a RAG system that's just based on one PDF file, and say it's like a 30-page file, so you chop it into maybe two chunks per page, and that way the embeddings kind of pick the right area of the application or the file, and don't send too much text. So whenever you get a chunk back, you're most likely going to be sending that whole chunk with your context to the LLM. So it would be in your prompt. Your prompt would lead something about there'd be a system part where you'd be saying you're XY type of system, and then you're going to use the data that I provide to answer this question. And then you would ask the question, and then you would provide the context. So that context would be the parts of the PDF that your retrieval system had determined were relevant to the question. So they're semantically similar. They shove that into the the context that goes to the LLM. So if you kind of tune that down to maybe the top three chunks, then it's going to be whatever size your chunk is. If it's like 300 characters with a say 100 overlap, which seems to be common, it's a pretty small chunk, but that's going to add up. You're going to have a prompt size that's going to the LLM over 1,000
Hmm.
or right around there. So that's not that bad. But when you start adding in the production level stuff, where it's got all of the safety stuff in it, that all needs to go into that prompt that goes across the wire to your LLM call so that it prevents it from, responding in mean language. It prevents a lot of the jailbreaking. Those prompts have a lot of extra stuff in there just as kind of boilerplate, and it adds to the size. So that's just a simple RAG implementation. Like with the text to SQL that I was playing with last week, I was trying to get it to describe some rows of data as the result, and I was calling the OpenAI API directly instead of going to the Azure, and I think I probably spent $10 to $15 in tokens
Hmm.
just playing around with it because I was doing a lot of experimentation and sending a lot of data across the wire back and forth. And I was kind of surprised whenever I would get the email saying that just add another $5 to my balance. It's like, okay, wow, that didn't take much. And then now I'm looking at the graph rack stuff. That's a lot more tokens. One of the demos I was watching last night said that it took like 1 million tokens to process a rather large document, 1 million tokens. So it's like
Mm.
this stuff adds up quick. And you do need to be aware of how the system is tuned. And I'm predominantly focusing on OpenAI, so I can't really talk to the other APIs out there. I'm not quite sure. They do have bigger context windows. I think Google's is in the millions of tokens that you can send it, which
Hmm.
means you can rack up your bill pretty fast if you're not watching what you're doing. And it does seem like for a production system, you're going to need to have an idea of what sort of usage you can get for what number of tokens, or otherwise, you're going to get the system out there in production and the brand newness of the system, and people start using it a lot. They're going to really take a hit and before it settles down and people kind of get to a normal usage. So
Hmm.
you're going to have to figure that out. And it's all a case by case scenario. That's for sure.
So this is a good point because we don't yet have a lot of reports of people who have used Azure OpenAI to integrate with existing custom applications to be able to report on what kind of bill what kind of bill they ended up paying to Azure for what kind of functionality that they got. And but we are hearing reports in some parts of the country, some of the power companies ask you to turn up your AC a few degrees to save power, but then at the same time we're being told, hey, but please buy an electric car and then plug it into your house to charge it overnight. And it's almost like these server farms that are running the AI models are using kind of the scale. I don't know if it's double or quadruple or what, but are using the scale of electricity that we could charge electric cars. It's not, it's not like a lamp on your bedside electricity, and it's not even a running air conditioner electricity. It's charge an electric car level electricity. And so that cost has to flow through to the customer. And so it would make sense that that cost is more than just running a website in Azure. But do you have any kind of anecdotal or experience to know, hey, here's the lowest that it'll ever cost to put any kind of OpenAI
Yeah.
capability in your application?
I don't. I'm working currently on a POC for a customer. So
Mhm.
they're not sure if this is going to go into production or not. But like, for instance, last week I was just toying around with the text to SQL. And like I mentioned, it cost 10 to 15 bucks. That was just me toying around with 1 week, one user.
For 1 week. Okay, for testing, for doing some interim
Yeah.
testing for a week.
Yeah. So if you take that and times it by 4, so say it was 15 rounded up, that's 60 bucks for a month for one user toying around.
Mhm.
That's also hitting GPT-4. I should have been hitting 4.0 instead because it's cheaper. So I
Okay.
made a mistake on that. But that kind of gives me an idea that if it's 60 bucks a week and say they're on a standard size web app, I mean, what are those, 70 bucks a month? Or so 60 bucks a month, I meant. So we're looking at almost the web hosting of
Mhm.
a standard web app for just one feature set. And I
Yeah.
don't, again, I have to admit that I'm ignorant as it comes to releasing this thing in the public yet. And hopefully, end of next month, we'll have it being evaluated and we'll know more details. But yeah, this is something you really are going to have to weigh whether or not that value is going to be provided by the application. I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting technology, and you can do quite a bit with it. But for my small business customers, they may put some of the stuff on hold or find ways to throttle it a bit so it doesn't exceed the cost that they want it to exceed.
Yeah. So let's put cost to the side because I think we're pretty safe to say that it's not going to be one of the cheaper Azure services to really put it to use. But let's just talk about the mechanics of how to
Mm.
make it work. So is it possible to, let's say, give it a chunk of data and then call it multiple times with different questions on the same set of data, or is it every single time you call you're sending up whatever data you need to?
Yeah, it's basically stateless. Unless
Okay.
you're doing an assistant on OpenAI, it's going to be pretty much stateless. If you go to the assistant route, then it will keep a thread. I have not played around with that myself, so I can't provide a lot of detail to that. But if you're accessing the OpenAI's endpoints for either the embeddings, which are relatively or really cheap compared to the chat endpoints,
Hmm.
that's pretty much stateless. You're giving it the state every time you want it. And if you have an application where you want to be able to provide the ability, like one of the examples that I was playing around with a while back was upload my resume to it
Hmm.
and then ask it a question about my resume. And then below, after I've asked a question, ask something like, something that assumes the prior conversation. That means that that prior conversation also had to be passed to the LLM so that it could use that as context to answer my question because it didn't keep any state.
Okay.
I
Okay.
had to pass that conversation along with it. And that's where the semantic kernel stuff starts to come into play. It makes it a lot easier, and it packages all the chat message and history up into one object so you can start to drop things out that you feel you need to drop out for size reasons.
Hmm.
So that's something that's I can totally see you need to do after you've got a certain amount of history because again, you're paying for all those tokens going back and forth the wire. So if part of that conversation is not going to be valuable any longer, then you don't want to be sending it back and forth. But I'm sorry, off of
Yeah. Yeah.
cost again, but yeah, the history is going to be important for a good user experience.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And one of the things that I use, I haven't completely automated it using the APIs yet, but even just introducing guests on the podcast, there's so many bios that are written in first person, and I'll literally take the bio paragraph and say, like for yourself, literally I said, reword in third person masculine, and then I quoted, the bio, and it rewords all the, the I am a to he is a, and it is pretty deterministic and pretty correct when for that type of scenario. And so you've mentioned there are certain scenarios where using its data, you don't know what you're going to get. It's kind of risky for a business application. But if you're asking it to operate on what you pass it, then it gets it right more often than not. Any scenarios where that is not the case that you've seen?
Well, I try to think of it as use it as maybe an intern, as you would an intern. And an intern knows certain things, but if it's your business, you want to kind of school them on your business before you trust them to, make the decision themselves. Though if it's something that's just general world knowledge, then you trust them to make the decision or provide the answer. But if it's specific to your scenario, your business needs, then you would want to provide them with more context to then take the reasoning that they had before they walked in the door, plus what you give them to then respond with something.
Hmm.
But the example that you gave, that's what they're designed to do. They're language models. They're
Hmm.
great at language tasks and, like provide a summary of this email, or here's a chunk of text. Can you describe it, give me the high level bullet points and then, uh, you know, a couple of paragraphs describing what it is. It's really good at that stuff because it's a language model. That's what it's great at. Math, not so much. Creating a graph, not so much. That's when the other interpreters need to come into play to actually write some code behind the scenes. They're actually good at writing code too. So not necessarily um, runnable C sharp code, but Python, they're really good at Python. They're good
Mm.
at C sharp, but the code interpreters that I've seen the companies work on out there are all Python interpreters, which I guess in the background, if it provides you the chart that you wanted because it used a Python graphics library
Hmm.
versus some C sharp, it doesn't really matter because you're looking for the chart. So a lot of these interpreters are using Python these days, but
Yeah.
they can provide that next level stuff that the language model can't do. That's just not what they do.
Gotcha. So for .NET developers who want to start testing out some scenarios with Azure Open AI or semantic kernel, where would you point them to in order to get something working quickly?
So my advice would be Michael Washington's blog. He has one out there. It's called Azure Open AI RAG Pattern Using SQL Vector Database. So if you search for that, or you just search for a simple RAG using SQL Server, that'll either come up with his or come up with my review of his blog. So either one will point to his blog and where you can download the code and all of that stuff. That's where I would recommend, because it's a hands-on way of getting used to using OpenAI and embeddings with the technologies that you already know. If you're not familiar with what Gen AI will do for you, then I would recommend looking up generative AI for beginners. There's a GitHub out there, Microsoft. There's like 18 modules in there. There's some .NET code in those modules, but overall, a lot of it's Python. But it will give you the concepts and the knowledge of what this Gen AI can do for you. So basically, it'll help you understand or give you a foundation so you can evaluate your problems that you have, your business problems, and decide, is this something that we can use to solve something we haven't been able to yet, or maybe solve something better? I would definitely recommend looking at it in a solution mindset versus trying to find something you can solve with, a chat application, trying to look for a problem. I would
Hmm.
recommend looking at the problems you already have, and then having an idea of what you can do with these Gen AI technologies and go from there.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Awesome. Well, we will include all of those links in the show notes so listeners can look at those there. Not only the ones from Michael Washington, but also um, your simple RAG SQL OpenAI and of course your blog at jasonhaley.com as well as that GitHub. So we'll make sure to include all of those. But Jason, thanks for coming on the Azure DevOps podcast and sharing with us your adventures in the various Azure services for artificial intelligence. Appreciate it.
But thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.